Because we live in a broken world, we can expect to have to face and deal with a variety of crisis situations. In recent years, several high-profile crisis situations have rocked entire communities and the kids who live there. Parents and youth workers will be called on to respond when a crisis hits close to home. Are there any steps we can take now to be sure that we're ready to act when a crisis hits? We'll be talking to our friend Rich Van Pelt about responding to crisis and dealing with trauma on this edition of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Youth Culture Matters. I'm Walt Mueller from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, and along with me today is Jason Soshnick from Project 619 on the other side of the country in Washington. Jason, welcome.
Good to be here.
Yep, always fun to chat about youth culture and have conversations about things that matter. And you know what? Before we get talking about youth culture, our guys over there who are running all the controls, or at least acting like they are, always like to throw a question at us. And I'm hoping that their questions always engage us in conversations that not only bring up great memories, and I want them to be great memories as we've grown up and our past years, but that allow us to see some of the cultural differences that exist between the generations, because I am a baby boomer born in 1956. Jason, what year were you born?
I was born in 76, so I would be a Gen Xer.
That's right. I got to remember. You're 20 years exactly. When is your birthday, by the way? It
was last month. It was in the middle of the month last month.
Do you have a date?
March.
Do you have a date?
I do. I March 16th.
Okay,
so
all right. I just want to be
now
sure
our
you know. When you
listening
say it's last month, I'm wondering what.
Oh,
you're
birthday.
afraid.
That's great.
Oh, so you're afraid. So if you publicize it, you're going to get too many gifts to be able to rifle through and handle.
No, so our question is,
I
what's
don't know
your
if I can
social
handle them
security
anymore.
number?
What's the social security number? Let's steal
because
identity.
I'm not afraid of the gifts. I'm afraid that it's going to hurt my back because I'm now 40.
Yeah,
That changes everything.
40 wasn't bad.
No, actually, I'm actually really excited. Age doesn't really bother me. I'm actually really excited to be 40 years old. It was. People ask like, what is it like to turn 40? And I just think, well, it's just another age for me.
And I'm telling you, you know what the hardest thing about getting older is?
What's that?
Dealing with young guys.
Oh, I know.
Yeah,
Man.
it's tough.
Are you talking about me? You're talking about me.
I don't.
Walt,
if you consider yourself to be young,
I appreciate you calling me young.
There you go. Younger guys.
So does that mean you're calling yourself old?
No, I said older. I didn't say old. Yeah,
No,
I still feel. Okay. I'm one of those guys who still feels mentally.
Please say spry.
Very young.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to say spry. I don't even know what that means.
Okay.
Yeah, but I still feel young, and in my head, I mean, there's some things that happen to your body that, you're realizing, man, I'm getting a little bit older. So.
Yeah, like what are those?
Well, I realized the other day that my hair's grayer than I thought, which is interesting because I don't spend a lot of time looking at my hair or thinking about it, but I came in here to the office, and we have an intern in here, Miguel, who's our bilingual intern, and he was standing over where all our books are stacked, and there's a couple of books over there that I've written that are out of print because they're older, and he was standing there looking in the back leaf of one that had a photo of me. And I saw him standing there as I walked across the room, and he looks at the photo, he looks up, he looks back at the photo, he looks at me, and he goes, "Man, you've gotten older." And before I escorted him out of the building, I did ask him, what do you mean? What do you mean? And he says, "Well, your hair's gray." And I said, "My hair's gray? It's totally gray?" And he said, "Yeah." And so when I went home, I had to say to Lisa, Miguel told me my hair's totally gray. And she looked at me, and rather than supporting me in my misunderstanding of what color my hair is. She goes, well, it is. And so it was devastating. You're speechless.
Well,
okay, all right. I don't know why I told you that
am.
story,
Hey,
but
I just want to say,
it's
you
okay.
still look great.
Okay,
you
great.
Look great.
Thanks. Well, coming from you, I'll sleep better tonight. Hey,
Good.
These guys. All right, so we've talked a little bit about what you have to look forward to there, Jason. But what you guys got a question for us?
This should play well into your generational gap here. Could, depending on your answers. Our question is: what is your favorite marketing campaign of all time?
Oh boy.
Oh,
Jason.
That's
do you have one?
So
I'm going to let you
I'll
go
start
first
with
this
one.
time. I got
Thanks for letting me go first. I think that I have two that I automatically think of because most people don't know. You know this, that I used to work in advertising and marketing. But this will not only show my age, but also just speak to the way that I sometimes think. But I had two. One of my favorite ones was the Budweiser "What's Up."
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
The campaigns, and you know why I don't think it's like the most clever. I don't think it's the one that stands out above the most. That it's the best. But the reason I think about that one is because "What's up?" was ingrained in every sort of conversation that happened in the 90s. When that campaign was going, everyone said that.
Got annoying.
And everyone knew what it was. It got annoying, but it referred to. And here's why I also like it. It was homegrown. Budweiser did not come up with that. It was a bunch of guys that proposed it as friends to Budweiser, and Budweiser took it and ran with it. In fact, I think that the original commercials had those guys in that commercial, and they were the ones that kind of came up with this. It was homegrown, which is a lot of what marketing campaigns are about today, but it was one of the first that happened in the 90s. And so I just think that just spun. And you can also tell the success of a campaign by how many other people mimic it. So many people mimicked it. I just remember being in a youth group and how many different youth groups would have some sort of "What's up?"
Yeah.
You know, that was a thing. The other one that I had was, and this was just more, I thought it was absolutely hilarious, was the E-Trade baby. That would always be doing something, saying something, but it was very adult-like, but it just really played upon the simplicity of E-Trade, while also talking about the complicated world we live in, and specifically with stocks and finances and whatnot. So those were the two that I just automatically think of when we come to marketing campaigns. What about you?
Well, I was thinking about why I let you go first. And the reason is that if I was born in 56 and you're 40 and I'm almost 60, I actually have 50% more memories of marketing campaigns that I have to rifle through. Is that the right math, Chris? 50%? Yep. Okay, all right.
Yeah,
so I had to go through a deeper file cabinet. But I'm going to go way back to when I was in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. And because I think an effective marketing campaign is one that creates and feeds desires, and it really catches your attention when you're engaged with it. So as a kid, I'm watching this, my favorite childhood TV show in the morning, Captain Kangaroo, and I know that he spans generations. Do you remember him?
Oh, I love Captain Kangaroo.
Captain Kangaroo was great.
Yeah.
He would do an ad for right there on the show for like a live commercial for Tootsie Roll Pops, and he had a Tootsie Roll Pop that was probably about 4 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet tall. It was like a large mock-up of a Tootsie Roll Pop that he had that stood on this table, and he would stand next to it, and he would take this huge wrapper off it, and you just see this thing. He'd talk about the Tootsie Roll Pop, and then the top of the pop, on top of the stick, the pop itself, it's split in half, kind of like a cutaway of the earth, if you remember that. And he would point out the different elements of the Tootsie Pop, the hard candy on the outside, then the Tootsie Roll center, the chewy Tootsie Roll center. And I just remember, I remember it. That's why it came to mind, because it always caught my attention, and I thought, that is so cool. As a little kid, I just thought that was so neat, and it made me always want to have a Tootsie Pop, and it made me want to have that chewy center. So
yeah,
that's it.
That's
my
really
marketing campaign.
That kind of advertising. Well, that kind of advertising has left. But it left, I should say. But I think it's returning. I'm seeing a lot. I see this on the radio a lot right now, where they have live promotions, and specifically here in Spokane. But I'm noticing this as I travel, and I don't know if you've seen this when you turn on the radio or something. They don't do it as much on TV yet, but I'm seeing it happen more and more where, you have product placement, but specific product placement. And, that was a big thing back in the 50s and the early 60s, and then it kind of went away.
Yep.
But I'm noticing there's a return to that. I'm noticing the live promotion where it's commentators speaking about the product that they are being paid to talk about, but they're talking about how they've used it, and I find that really interesting.
All right, let me ask these guys. Kenton, do you have one real quick?
I've been sitting here thinking about it, and I actually have two of them, and I'll make it quick. One of them is from when I was in elementary school, and it was the how many licks does it take to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop with the owl. And I remember everybody in school, we'd always be sitting there during a movie and licking our Tootsie Pop. But the other one, this one's very recent, and it's actually the Apple ad with Taylor Swift running on the treadmill. I don't know if you've seen it yet.
I try to avoid Apple ads, and especially Apple ads with Taylor Swift.
She is running on a treadmill and trying to sing along to this new Apple Music song, and she just falls flat on her face right on the treadmill, and it's hilarious. And so, as an Apple fan, I kind of enjoy it, but I also get to see Taylor Swift just kind of faceplant.
Yes. You know what that's called when you get excited about someone, having a major fail like that? There's a German word. It's called Schadenfreude. And it's basically a word that describes when you take great delight in other people's pain and heartache.
Yeah. It just happens.
Yeah. I'm glad you're here, Kenton. Chris, what do you?
Well, I probably have a list of campaigns I don't like longer than my arm.
Well, I should have expected
I should
this.
probably be an ad critic of some sort. But two that come to mind, one from childhood would be the Micro Machines commercial, specifically the Micro Machine Man and how fast he spoke. I loved Micro Machines. I loved hearing that guy's voice. That was one, as a kid, connected with me really well. The commercials weren't great. It was really just that guy's voice that made those commercials. And then the other campaign that I've always really appreciated is the This Is Sports Center commercials that ESPN. They're sort of a long-running tradition.
Oh, those are great.
That ESPN has done for This Is Sports Center.
Good. Well, pay attention to marketing because marketing. There's nothing haphazard. Jason, you know that because you were in marketing. We've studied marketing here, and marketing really does influence. And I'm sure at some point we'll be talking more about marketing and the way marketing works and some of the concerns about marketing and how to do marketing. I mean, we need marketing, how to do marketing to the glory of God. We want to encourage our kids, if they have a bent towards that, to go into marketing and do it right. Well, let's talk about youth culture. We've got some stories here for our 2-minute drill. And let me kick off real quick with this one, Jason. And, we've talked a lot about kids and youth sports. In fact, last night I was at a store locally here and ran into one of my oldest son Josh's high school football coaches, and we had a conversation for about an hour. It was a great conversation, catching up. And one thing led to another. We got talking because he's still coaching youth sports, basketball, football, and I'm not sure what else, but we got talking about the pressure that parents are putting on kids, and he was telling me about a conversation he had with a dad who was paying $80 an hour for his son to have a quarterback coach, a private quarterback coach, so $80 an hour. And that's not unusual. I've heard this before. But then he proceeds to tell me that the kid is in 3rd grade. $80 an hour for this kid to get quarterback lessons in 3rd grade. So there's a whole other conversation there. But that on the heels of yesterday listening to Terry Gross on Fresh Air podcast with NPR, where she interviewed this guy named Jeff Passan, who's written a book called The Arm, subtitled Inside the $1 Billion Mystery, the Most Valuable Commodity in Sports. A lot about the pressures we're putting on kids. He talked a lot about that. He talked a lot about Tommy John surgery. In fact, that's where this focused. And I happened to run into an article yesterday about Tommy John reconstructive surgeries on the rise among young athletes, which is something that he, as the author of this book, talked about as well. And new studies found a dramatic increase in the number of adolescents, and we would say even younger kids, undergoing Tommy John surgery to repair a pitching-related elbow injury, outstripping growth among major league pitchers. So more kids rather than major league pitchers are getting this. This is where a torn or ruptured ligament in the elbow known as the ulnar collateral ligament, the UCL, is replaced with a tendon from another part of the body. He gave graphic descriptions of this, drilling holes in the bone and then putting this in. And I'm just going to say, it's he says a lot of the reason for this is the way that we're pushing our kids. And so parents, you need to lay back on your kids. Coaches, you need to lay back on your kids, because we're not only instilling in them perhaps some sort of idolatry, some sort of sports idolatry, but we're hurting them. We're hurting their bodies.
The next article that I came across was the one that talked specifically about this year's freshman class, that it's actually most likely to protest. In fact, it's more likely to protest than that of the 60s and 70s, the students in the 60s and 70s. The article highlighted this. It said, today's college freshmen are more likely to participate in a student-led protest than each of the nearly 5 decades of classes that preceded them. According to the survey results that this article was speaking about, they said that this includes freshmen in the late 60s and the 70s era that was storied for its on-campus political activism, which I find absolutely amazing. That there is actually a group, and I actually see this happening as I travel from one campus to another, as we've stepped foot on some of the different college campuses to have conversations, and then even the conversations that we have, there is a charge that I sense among this class of freshmen that's different than any of the others. My wife and I have worked in a college or at a college for the last several years, and seeing some of the change, it's been something that's very tangible. We're actually noticing this. Some of the things that they actually pointed to that I just want to highlight here is that students have a heightened interest in political activism, which they actually say could be a strong force in this year's elections, and specifically leaning much more to the left. I think we're seeing this with the Bernie Sanders campaign, the number of young people that are showing up to support Bernie Sanders. And so I think that this research is actually backing up what we're seeing at a lot of the rallies for someone like Bernie Sanders. It said that 60% of freshmen surveyed said there was a very good chance they would vote in a federal, state, or local election while in college. Now that's up nearly 10 percentage points. I've actually read somewhere else where it could potentially be up anywhere between 15 to 20%. So we talk a lot about Obama drawing a lot of youth into the voting percentage. But what we're actually finding is that actually might be increasing and climbing, and actually that could have a tremendous influence on this year's election. So I find this really, really interesting that we just have this freshman class that's so willing to step out and to protest where they need to have their voice be heard.
That's interesting. I'm just going to mention real quick, because I looked up that article, Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a respected publication and one that is relied on quite a bit. And they had results of numerous answers to questions that freshmen have given over the course of the years. And one that popped up that really struck me, because I always wonder, why are we protesting? What is beneath the protest? It's not just what we're protesting, but why, what's driving that. And I'll just mention this, because this parents and youth workers, we need to address this, that when it comes to the life goals of college freshmen, they've looked at the life goal of being very well off financially. Is that a life goal? In 1975, and that happens to be when I was a college freshman, 74 to 75, 47% of students listed that as a life goal, being very well off financially. Today, that number is 82%. And every year that has climbed. When you look at that graph, you see how over the decades it's climbed. All right, so I got one here that this is one where when I saw this study, I thought it was interesting because we track with drug trends, and especially when we talk about the adolescent brain and drug trends, but the title of the study was rather interesting. This comes from the journal Neuroscience, and it says, Rat Study Reveals Long-Term Effects of Adolescent Amphetamine Abuse on the Brain. And a study of rats given regular high doses of amphetamine finds that those exposed to the drug at an age corresponding in the rat to human adolescent experience, they experience long-term changes in brain function that persist into adulthood. and it messes with dopamine signaling. I mean, we know that introducing substances into our body, that drug abuse or substance abuse or experimenting with drugs and alcohol, because the brain is so malleable and in such a formative stage, especially during adolescence, it does affect, and it's long term. And so everything's pointing to this, whether it's marijuana, whether it's amphetamines, that there are consequences, behavioral consequences related to addiction and relapse, all kinds of things, cognitive function. And I'll just mention to you one thing here. This sentence just struck me as being really funny. I actually highlighted this and thought, this is just great. It says, rats exhibit, this is a quote from one of the study's lead researchers, rats exhibit many of the characteristics that human adolescents do. And then he goes on. Yeah, so that was kind of interesting. But yeah, so again, the need to, we can't look at these things as, hey, everyone's doing it, it's normal, or it's okay.
Yeah.
This stuff affects our kids, and stewardship of the body for those who are followers of Christ. We need to be about that. We need to understand that and work to prevent and treat alcohol and substance abuse, and in this case, amphetamine abuse among our kids.
I agree. Well, going along just with the idea of substances, California just approved raising the smoking age. Now, that's not necessarily a substance that we were talking about before, but tobacco. And there's been some conversation of this already, with Hawaii raising its age at which individuals can smoke. In California, its legislators just passed a law to raise the smoking age to 21. But they also, and this is really unique, the bill would also restrict electronic cigarettes and label them the same as tobacco products, which you and I are familiar with, that these e-cigs, as they're labeled, are very, very popular for a lot of teens, a lot of young adults. And the reason that they said that they increased the age was because at 18, older teens can still buy or purchase cigarettes for their younger friends, younger peers. And the law would actually limit that you wouldn't have that happening anymore, because what they're trying to limit is the number of early smokers, because you typically pick up smoking, what they're arguing, when you're in your teen years, late teen years. And so what they're trying to do is stop that through this bill. And so I find this really fascinating. Now, what they did say, that if you serve in the military, you can still purchase cigarettes at the age of 18. I'm assuming that would be something that would be done on your base or whatever. But overall, it's for those that are 21 and over that can purchase cigarettes. So this is the first of its kind, and I actually think, because of how large California is, that this is going to be a trend that we see across the rest of the country, which I think is really good. I actually think that raising the age at which you first the age at which you first start to smoke actually would change the habits of those, because you pick up this habit at such a young age.
And by the way, one of the statistics that we've been quoting for a long time, I hope I get this right, is 80% of adults who smoke started smoking before the age of 18. So yes. there's a whole another line trail we can.
And they
go
started
down there
farting way before that.
Yeah,
so
yeah. All right, here's one that and this is a sign of the times here. And I don't know if you saw this. A couple of stories came out in the last couple of weeks about photos that have been taken, selfies that have been taken. One of the most prominent is the story of the hijacker on Egypt Air, who had a belt on made of what were they? iPhone cases, I guess. He didn't have any explosives, but he hijacks this plane, and in the midst of the hijack, this young guy named Ben Innes hops up and asks if he can take a selfie with the hijacker. And if you see the picture, the selfie, the young guy who takes the selfie, he's just mugging it up for the camera. It's just crazy when you think about it. We're trying to capture every moment. Well, here's a story that was equally alarming to me, and this one comes out of Sarasota, Florida, where the family of a man who was killed in a rather violent, fiery highway crash. is upset because a teenager who was involved in the crash put a photo on Instagram that shows him smiling next to one of the wrecked vehicles. And the family, they lost their family member.
Their loved one.
And so if you see this picture, it's just kind of crazy. Not only that, this is one of the kids who was in the car that was crashed into, but the young man who took the photo has been charged because they had to go find the wrecked car. They found it parked at an apartment complex, and the kids were taken into custody because they took off. They fled the scene of the accident. They didn't even, it says they didn't even have the decency to at least pull over and call 911. And the driver and the passenger in the car were not named because they're both minors, but he does face charges for leaving the scene of a crash and violating his learner's permit. But it's just alarming to me that we would look for these photo opportunities and smile in the midst of crisis when things are going horribly wrong.
Yeah. Well, the last article that we have is just David Brooks actually just wrote this, and I thought this was a really fascinating and compelling.
He is always worth
article.
Reading, by the way, David Brooks.
Oh my gosh,
just a great writer and columnist.
Good. Yeah, and I just resonate so much of what he's saying this political season. I'm just watching the rhetoric this political season be different than any other that I remember. Now, I'm not as old as you, but I just don't remember a lack of civility as much as this year. I just feel like every political season is getting more and more aggressive. That the rhetoric that's being shared is becoming more and more aggressive. And this year, the thing that David Brooks points out, and this is actually something that I've spoken about often, is the way in which we're talking about others, and specifically in this case, women. It is grotesque. And one of the things that he talks about is that it's become misogynistic. One of the things that Brooks writes, he says, these days we're living through another great redefinition of masculinity. Today, both men and women are called upon to live up to the traditional ideals of both genders. So the ideal man, at least in polite society, gracefully achieves a series of balances: steady, strong, verbal, vulnerable, emotionally open and willing to cry, but also restrained and resilient. However, he says the masculinity the campaign that Trump is putting forward, and I would argue that others have now mimicked. We saw this several weeks ago, a couple of months ago, when some of the other candidates tried to match Trump at his game. They said it just changed the way in which manners, civility, all of these things started to take place. As part of the masculinity that Trump is talking about, he rejects the new imbalanced masculine and feminine ideal that's emerged over this past generation and embraces one that in some ways is old but in other ways new. And it's just an unvarnished misogyny. And his misogyny has a commercial flavor. So it's one of competition. It's one that seeks to emasculate the other rival. Now we're seeing this right now with Cruz and with Trump. And I just think we've got to be aware of this as practitioners, because this is having a tremendous impact on those that are following the campaign. But I also think of those that are adolescent. I think of the influence that Bill Clinton had on me. I was preparing to vote in my first ever election right around the time that Bill Clinton had his affair with Monica Lewinsky. And that forever changed what oral sex was, right? It was right around then that the definition began to change, because he said, I did not have sex with that woman. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. And I think that this political season is just as charged as that, and probably even more so. And this is going to have an impact on the way that I believe teens and now young adults will have conversation, because what we're seeing is others are stepping up, not stepping down or away from this conversation.
Yeah. And we say here all the time, and watching the politics, I think this year affirms this, but we say all the time that culture is both a map and a mirror. It mirrors back to us the kinds of things that we believe. If we act it out, we think that it's okay. Our behaviors tell us what our beliefs are, but it's also a map. And especially for, as you said, adolescents, impressionable young kids who are watching this, life is being defined for them. Politics is being defined for them. Matters of civility are being defined for them. Borders and boundaries are being stretched and defined. Male and femaleness are being defined. How to treat other people, that's being defined. So we need to track with this, watch it, celebrate and affirm those things that we can celebrate and affirm from a biblical perspective, and challenge those things that need to be challenged. Karl Barth said once, the theologian, every Christian needs to start their day with a Bible in one hand, the newspaper in the other. And that's why we talk about these stories, because this is the newspaper, and we want to see how the Scriptures speak to these things. Well, this is good, Jason. Thank you. When we come back from a break, we're going to have a timely conversation. You know, we are releasing this podcast on the day that is the 17th anniversary of the Columbine massacre. That was a defining moment in my life as someone who studies youth culture. It was a watershed moment for our culture, and one of the guys who was there, who stepped in at the end, lived in a community and was involved in a lot of the response efforts and talking to students and talking to parents and working with youth workers who were talking to students and talking to parents, is our dear friend, Rich Van Pelt. And we're going to have a conversation with Rich about how youth workers and parents can begin to respond to crisis. What are some of the things we can do in a preventive way, you know, to do this? And what are some of the lessons, the key lessons that were takeaways from that situation in Colorado 17 years ago? So when we come back, we're going to have a conversation about crisis and trauma with Rich Van Pelt. In an effort to help you help the kids you know and love navigate the difficult landscape of the emerging digital frontier to the glory of God, we've launched a Digital Kids Initiative here at CPYU. Thanks to a generous grant from a company called DAS, you can access our Digital Kids Initiative and a growing number of free resources and downloads by visiting the website at digitalkidsinitiative.com. This is one more way that we're helping you lead your kids to live lives where their faith in God is integrated into the growing amount of time they're spending with social media and technology. Hey, welcome back, everybody. I'm Walt Mueller at the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, and on this episode of Youth Culture Matters, we want to talk about an anniversary. This time of year, April and April 20th, in fact, is an anniversary in pop culture. A lot of folks know it as 420, that day when, thinking about marijuana, that police code for, marijuana or drugs, 420. But also, even bigger than that, I think, it's the anniversary now this year, 17 years since what's become known as the Columbine massacre. And, for me, that was really a watershed time in youth culture. It was not the first time that something happened at a school, but it certainly was at the time the biggest and a watershed time, because it really got us thinking at many levels. Parents, youth workers, educators, anybody who cares about kids, just as a culture at large, about hurting kids, about things like anger, violence, media influence, bullying. All kinds of topics came up from that in the aftermath of that, and even some of those discussions continue. But there's so much we can learn as youth workers from that, because the unfortunate thing, and I've been looking at a list today of school shootings over the years, is that these things have picked up in some ways, and certainly school shootings aren't the only type of crisis that we deal with hurting kids, but there's so many lessons we can learn from that. And one of my best friends in the whole world, in the world of youth ministry too, is my buddy Rich Van Pelt. Rich, thanks for coming on here with us.
You bet. My pleasure.
And Rich, you've got, here's what I love about you, and that is that it's not just your tender heart, but it's the experiences God has given you with your tender heart and your ability to listen to kids and to respond to kids that have, for so many of us in the world of youth ministry, made you someone that we look to in terms of how to respond to hurting kids. And I know you were involved firsthand in the response there in Colorado when all that happened. And we're going to talk about that, but just give us a little bit of your background, what you're doing now, but how you got to the point where you really have learned so much about helping hurting kids.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting story, Walt, because I set out years ago in undergraduate work. I had originally thought about medicine, and then it became apparently clear that God had not wired me in that direction academically. And so I shifted to sociology, psychology. And it was during my college years that I sensed a clear call to ministry, and um, did my seminary preparation at Gordon Conwell in Massachusetts, and
We know that
and then
well. Yep.
yeah, you do started out by working in a local church, but after serving in a church for a couple years, I really started to recognize that my heart was beating for kids who were outside the reach of the local church. And through a series of circumstances, God called me to Colorado to to begin a ministry with Youth for Christ here, called Youth Guidance, or to expand the ministry that they had, to really influence the world of kids who fall between the cracks here in Colorado. And so for 10 years, I actually worked as the chaplain for the Department of Corrections, the Division of Youth Services. And for me, I had the privilege of working with a multidisciplinary team of psychiatrists, psychologists, psychiatric social workers, people who were phenomenally equipped and trained and had a passion for kids who hurt. And I've told several people through the years, for me, it was my practicum in learning really not only the praxis of working with kids in crisis, but it pushed me to do research to back it up. And in 1987, Zondervan gave me my first opportunity to write a book, which back then was called Intensive Care, Helping Teenagers in Crisis.
I have it in my hands right now as we speak.
Yeah, that's an oldie moldy.
It's awesome. Hardback. It's great. And
right.
I was flipping through it. I pulled it off the shelf. I've got so much marked up in this. Just a great resource.
Well, then, as you know, through the years, I had some unique opportunity to begin to speak and train youth workers, parents, even teenagers on how to identify kids at risk, kids who hurt, and particularly in crisis situations, how to make a difference. My conviction for years has been, Walt, that probably the folks we need to train most are kids, because they're the ones who typically know at first that things are not going well with siblings or with friends. And so I've had a passion for equipping students to help their friends, parents to help the kids in their homes, and then youth workers, teachers, professionals who have the opportunity to intersect with kids at various points. These days, my journey has taken a little bit of a different turn in that now my focus is the world's hurting kids, as I have the privilege of working in the Ministry of Compassion International and representing the desperately poor in 26 countries of the world.
Rich, let me back up a minute. When you came out of seminary, what year was that when you first started with this?
Yeah, I graduated in 1973.
Okay. So, mid-70s, you God calls you into this ministry. Just as you look back over the years, and I'm thinking about this, there were two things you said. One is that you're trying to reach the kids who are outside the reach of the local church. First question I have for you is, have those numbers increased, a percentage of kids who are troubled and outside the reach of the local church? Same, worse? From where you sit, what you've seen.
My sense is, boy, it certainly feels like the numbers have grown in terms of kids who were just not reaching, or maybe the secularization of the culture to the extent that they're just not as open to being involved. But we struggled with those same issues in the 70s, working in the ministry of the church. And Walt, I should add one thing here, because I want to make it really clear. I am a church guy. You know that.
Oh, yeah.
But, when I say that I felt called to specifically to work with those kids who seem to be outside the reach of the church, one of the greatest pieces of advice I got during my seminary years by a godly professor, William Nigel Kerr, who I had the privilege of working in a local church with. While I was doing my internship, he was the interim pastor. And
church history.
Yeah, that's right.
Church history prof up there had him too.
I was thinking very seriously of just jumping into parachurch ministry, and one of the greatest pieces of advice I was ever given was, he said, Rich, if you're going to do that, I want to challenge you then to first give yourself to working in the local church for a couple years so you understand the bride. And that has carried with me for years, Walt. And I think it had deep influence on my life, my love for the church, my appreciation for youth workers who work in the context of the church and some of the challenges of it. But, one of the reasons I was drawn to compassion was because compassion takes the local church seriously. It's not one of the ways we do ministry. It's the only way that we do ministry. So that's an important caveat for me.
Yeah, that's good. That is good. That's a whole nother podcast there. We're going to have to follow up on that. Well, a second question I wanted to ask you about the things you said there. You talked about students being on the front lines. They're sometimes the first ones to hear from their friends about the struggles. Again, related question, would you say that over the years, as kids have become more and more disconnected from parents and other adults in their lives, that it's actually become more necessary for us as the culture's changed and as relationships have changed in that culture to train kids how to intervene in crisis and read the signs and be that front line, first connect between someone who's hurting and getting them help. I mean, that's,
yes, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I don't think I could say it better than you've just said it, Walt. I think back to that classic movie Breakfast Club that I still think has
love it
so much to say to us as people who care about students. What's different about the look of the typical campus is that now, kids aren't in those large subgroupings that they used to live and exist in. Now they're in these dyads and triad relationships, and so it's even harder to identify the kids at risk and get them help. And so even more so in this day and age, we have to be intentional, I think, about alerting students not only to the opportunity, but to the responsibility that they have for their friends. And I know that even one of our good friends would maybe take issue at putting too much responsibility on students, but I'm one who has always believed that we need to call kids to task and help them understand they are not the church of tomorrow. They're the church of today, and God wants to use them to make a difference in their campus and places where they work. And this is one of the ways that they really can do that.
That's good. That's good. And that's a good challenge for everyone who's listening, that I think just cultural realities and necessities require us to equip kids, and the fact that as part of the church, they're worthy of being equipped. And
Absolutely.
so that's important.
Yeah.
Hey, let's switch gears here a little bit and go back, to 1999, because you were involved there in the Littleton area with the youth workers and the churches and what happened there. We don't have to rehash what actually happened, but we've heard a lot about that. I mean, you can bring up what you want, but I'm more concerned about what were the things that you learned, or the folks that you were working with learned, the key learnings that came out of that as you responded to a really severe crisis.
Yeah, there are a number of things probably that come to mind, Walt. And I want to clarify that I was actually on my way to speak at the Ichthus Music Festival when I started getting calls from youth workers in the Littleton area asking me where I was, because they wanted my assistance. I fortunately was able to fly back, and one of the first things I did when I got back to Denver was drive out to a church in the area where about a couple dozen youth workers who had been in the trenches for the last day and a half, doing what they could, gathered to pray and to cry and to I think probably acknowledge their sense at that time of just being absolutely overwhelmed by what had taken place. And in the course of the next couple of weeks and then months and years, I think for those of us who stayed the course and committed to be God's men and women in the midst of a horrific situation, we learned a couple significant things. One, you will never be prepared for something like that. There just is not a manual. And you'll never, as much as you try to equip yourself and be equipped, you'll never be adequately equipped. Secondly, and this is what we celebrate, God uses people who simply make themselves available. Someone said years ago, God doesn't call us because we're qualified. He qualifies us because we're called. And if there's anything we sensed at that time in the midst of the horror of this situation, is that we were called for such a time as that to be God's men and women, to come next to kids and their parents and people who were terrified by what had just taken place. Thirdly, kids need safe places. And on two levels, Walt. One, high-risk kids need safe places to talk about what they're dealing with and what they're considering. I've just finished reading Sue Klebold's book, A Mother's Reckoning, Living in the Aftermath of Tragedy. The mom of one of the two perpetrators of what's now probably still the worst school shooting in history, Dylan Klebold. And if there's anything that resounds in that book, it's that Dylan, for the majority of his young life, up until his junior year in high school, was a really normal kid. But unbeknownst to his parents, for 2 years had been struggling deeply with depression and suicidal ideation. And apparently didn't feel the freedom to talk with anybody. He journaled about it, and those were found later by the police. But if his mom has any deep regret, it's that she didn't know more about depression and she didn't know more about suicidal ideation and wasn't alert to pick up the signs. High-risk kids like a Dylan, who are in our youth groups, who are in our homes, need safe places where they can talk about unsafe things. And then the second thing we've learned is that when there is a crisis like a Columbine or any of the number of situations that have happened since then, kids need a safe place to be. You know, I was struck a couple nights after the Columbine shooting by a national newscaster who in reporting on the news, said the following. He said, "The psychiatric community is flooding Littleton." And honestly, we were blessed with people who were incredibly gifted, who are just willing to offer resources and gifts to make available. So psychiatrists, psychologists were saying, any way we can help be available to kids, we want to serve, just to serve. So he said, the psychiatric community is flooding Littleton. And then there was a dramatic pause. And he continued by saying this, but the kids are flocking to the churches. That was significant, Walt, because the churches hadn't all of a sudden become safe places. See, in the course of the years leading up to Columbine, there was an intentional effort out in that southwest region of our city, on the part of a gathering of a cross-sectional group, Catholic, Protestant youth workers called the Southwest Connection, to come together, not to do events together, but to pray for kids in that part of the city. They were prompted by a gathering of senior pastors who were doing the same thing. But it was because, I think, of that intentionality for several years prior to Columbine, that when Columbine happened, kids already knew that those were safe places that they could go to. So kids need safe places. Fourthly, you will need support. If you offer your availability as a parent, as a youth worker, when something like this happens, when the stuff hits the fan, you can't go it alone. You don't have that capacity. One of the roles I filled was to be the second line of support. I was not in the trenches. The youth workers who had relationship with students were the ones who were meeting with moms and dads who had lost their kids. They were the ones who were going to hospitals to visit kids who had their shoulders shot off, who ones primarily sitting and listening to kids tell their stories over and over of hiding in a library or hiding in a closet and hearing the shooting going on outside and being so terrified by what was going on. What I and some others of us, Jim Hancock, some of you will know Jim as the co-author of some of the books that I've written. Jim and I were able to provide backup support to those folks, encouragement, loving, and some equipping so that they knew what they were doing really was on target. And then I think the only other additional thing, Walt, I would say as a lesson from Columbine, we could talk for probably hours, but you can and you should be proactive. I say all the time that who you are in crisis is so much more important than what you know. But what you know is critically important. So now is the time to do the diligence of preparing, of understanding what are some of the telltale signs of a kid who's depressed, of a kid who might be suicidal, of someone who's struggling with alcohol and drugs. Do the diligence of learning about cutting and about abuse. And these other kinds of issues that often are triggers to kids who do these horrific things, but also are the kinds of things that many of the kids in our groups are struggling in silence to try and cope with. So, I want to encourage people who are listening to this podcast, but I guess I also want to encourage, and Walt, you didn't ask me to do this, but I am so excited about the series of seminars that you and Marv are doing across the country on helping hurting kids. And I know that that's going to be coming to the cities of many of the folks who are listening to this podcast. And I want to encourage you to take advantage of that because it's life-saving information. I can't tell you how many times I've had folks sitting in a seminar that I taught who then a couple weeks later will call me and say, Rich, this week I had an opportunity to use what I learned in that seminar that you just taught. So be proactive and take the opportunity to get yourself as equipped as you can. Pick up resources and identify helping professionals in your city and programs that exist where you can refer kids to get the help that they need.
Yeah, this is good, Rich. And I've seen that happen after seminars with you and Marv, because you two guys are the ones who really get into some of the deep stuff, thanks to your experience, your counseling backgrounds, and what I realize is, all that stuff's been there. I think it's just as a result of hearing about it, making themselves aware, that then they go back with their kids and they see things that they had never seen before that were always there, and they can respond. This is good. We're going to take a little break, but when we come back, Rich, one of the things I want to talk to you about, I want to talk to you a little bit about trauma, because there's some things I've learned from you about that, and you've alluded to how we help kids walk through that. And then secondly, I want to talk about what you were just speaking of, and that is the whole idea of, be proactive, prepare yourself now. What are some specific things we can do or signs we can look for? What would you say are some of the most urgent things? I know you've mentioned some things already, but when we come back, we'll hit on that. Stay with us, and we'll be right back to Youth Culture Matters after this break. Here at CPYU, we want to help you help parents stay up to date on today's youth culture. One of our most popular resources is our monthly parent page. This 4-page full-color resource offers parents a timely, practical look into current youth culture trends, along with resources to help them parent their children and teens Christianly in today's rapidly changing youth culture. If you're a youth worker who would like to get this monthly resource into the hands of your parents, you can see a sample parent page and learn more by visiting cpyuparentpage.com. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're talking to Rich Van Pelt on Youth Culture Matters, a great friend of CPYU. Rich has worked with us over the years. I've sat in a lot of his training. We've been able to offer it to people. So helpful. And Rich, we really appreciate you and your availability to the Lord to do what you're doing, and now how you've turned around and spent so many years training youth workers. And so thanks for that. Now, I one of the things we do here after we come back after this break is a little moment of interaction where we ask you some questions. We call this Take 5. I had some fun doing this with our good friends Marv Penner and Duffy Robbins a couple of weeks ago. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fire, you haven't heard these, I'm going to fire 5 questions at you and answer them quickly. Some of them may require you to think a little bit. I'm not trying to trick you with anything here. But these are just some questions I thought up as I thought about you and our friendship and knowing your heart. So here we go. You ready, Rich?
I'm ready.
Okay, all right. You're not nervous.
Well, I think I'm ready.
Are you nervous? Marv?
Yeah, because you've come up
Marv
with
Marv was watching me on the video feed, and he thought I had a very devious look on my face. So, but I think he thinks that all the time. Voice. So I make that face a lot. All right, so number 1, here we go. Let's go back to your childhood. You're 10 years old. What did you want to become when you grew up?
I really wanted to be a doctor.
Okay. So that stuck with you right till you made the shift and went to seminary.
Yeah, it sure did.
Okay. All right. Number 2. You live in Colorado. It is beautiful there. I've been there with you and enjoyed the beauty. If you could spend an hour standing in one spot in Colorado to take in the view, where would you stand?
Oh, absolutely. It's Breckenridge. It's my favorite little Colorado mountain town. Love that place.
It's great. And you were able to introduce us to that. Lisa and I were there with you last summer, and that was a great trip. All right, so this one, you went back to your Gordon Conwell years, and I love talking about Gordon Conwell because it was so formative in my life. But when you go back to Gordon Conwell, when you think about Gordon Conwell, what was the best class that you took in seminary, the course that impacted your life the most?
Wow, that's a really tough question.
Well, how about a professor? Let's go with that. I mean, you mentioned...
Yeah, there were several profs that were significant in my life. Addison Leach, who was the second husband of Elizabeth Elliot, and so because of that relationship, Ad was he was my seminary advisor, and so I had the privilege of spending time in their home several times, and was really influenced by his love for the church, his passion for people, I think.
What did he teach? He was not there when I was there. What did he teach?
Well, he taught specifically. I had him for Presbyterian polity because I was a Presbyterian renegade who did not choose to go to a Presbyterian seminary, and so. Even though he was a Presbyterian guy, he was teaching at a seminary that was not just for Presbyterians.
That became an issue later. Well, we won't talk about that. Number 4, when you travel for compassion, and we've been on trips with you, so we see this, but I'm just asking, when you travel for compassion, what gives you the greatest joy?
Well, you're going to hear a common theme here, Walt, but I think the greatest joy is to see the Church of Jesus doing what it's called to do in reaching the least of these. Because everywhere we go, we visit a local church that's ministering to generally speaking, about 250 children and youth, and helping them, in so many areas.
Yeah, we've seen it.
Feeding them and clothing them and helping them get to school, get a good education. Most importantly, learn about Jesus and how much he loves them. But the joy for me is as I travel all around the world, seeing the church being the church, reaching out in the community and loving on people in Jesus' name.
Yeah. I think, I'm just going to add to that because I've seen this, that going with you, we see these people who in the church who have nothing giving everything and that, when we're in another country, and then to come back and know that God has given us so much to be good stewards with and to share, just a good thing. All right, last question, real quickly. Best advice you can give to young youth workers?
Oh, that's really tough.
I got an idea on this here because as I was asking the question, I remember something you shared when we were at the YS convention about a year or so ago, and you received, I'll bring this up, the Lifetime Achievement Award, which was great and well-deserved. You stood up there and you shared something that someone had once told you. Do you remember what I'm thinking about?
Yeah.
You take care of the, how did you say that, about the breadth and the depth of ministry? And
yeah, well, I reference the fact that I'm asked all the time by youth workers, how do I do what you do? And I give them the advice that I was given years ago by my mentor, pastor at the time, who said, Rich, your responsibility is the depth of your ministry. God's responsibility is the breadth of your ministry.
Yeah.
So be faithful and go deep, and then allow God to do what he wants to do with it.
That's great advice, especially in a world where, most young youth workers and even older youth workers are being nurtured to seek celebrity in the celebrity-oriented culture, a social media-driven culture, to develop an audience. And really, I just when I heard you say that, I just thought that is just brilliant. That is wonderful advice. So, thanks for being a good sport and taking those questions. Maybe I didn't try to make them hard. Hopefully, they were easy enough.
They were fun.
Okay, good. Well, let's go back and let's go back. I just want to hit on this Columbine thing and lessons learned afterwards real quickly. Are you able in a couple of minutes to? We talked about key learnings. Here are the kinds of things that youth workers and parents should be aware of and should be doing. Was there anything that came out of that regarding what we shouldn't do? Some don't do's. These are.
Yeah, one thing in particular jumps off the page for me, Walt, and it's part of the responsibility or one of the roles that I played in the Columbine intervention, we'll call it, our response as a Christian youth ministry community here in Colorado. Part of my job was to protect the kids, the parents, the youth work community from the Christian community at large, particularly that Christian community outside of Colorado that wanted to come in to Colorado and take advantage of the situation. We got calls from speakers who wanted to come in and speak to people. We got calls from musicians who felt like they should be at the big memorial. My phone literally rang off the hook. And honestly, people got really mad when we said, we appreciate the offer, but we're good. We'd really appreciate if you would pray for us. And if we have a need, we'll call, but please don't call back. Unfortunately, a lot of people didn't hear that message, and they were far more interested in coming than they were in praying.
Yeah. That's good, and that's good. And again, that goes back to what I said before, that we are being nurtured, sort of into our basest desires, to take the spotlight, to be in the center of attention. It's about us and not about, bring glory to us rather than bring glory to God. That even comes into play in a situation like that where there's been deep hurt, there's great need and need for ministry, and yet what drives people to quote unquote help or show up, it's not pure motives. So that's excellent advice. Let me ask you about trauma a little bit, and because you and I have had conversations about this over the years. It's interesting, you and Marv, and I won't go into this, but there was a time a few years ago where I got personally hit pretty hard with a couple of things, physically, relationally, emotionally, that sort of thing. And so I was trying to work through that, and I would see you guys every month or so. And I can still remember a conversation in a meeting room we had. I think we were doing a late night at a youth specialties convention together, and we got in there early, and it was you. You said, you looked at me and you said you're dealing with some of the wake of trauma. And I looked at you like, huh? What? And, that stuck with me. And what I was dealing with was minimal compared to what most people do. But that stuck with me, and I've tried to learn as much as I can about trauma. It seems that more and more people are talking about it now. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is a big topic not only in the mental health community, but there are books being written about it that people can read. A lot of the vets who are coming back are speaking about this. So it seems like we're on a journey to understand this more. And certainly the kids there in any other situation where there's a relational crisis, maybe in the home or a weather-related event or a school shooting, whatever it is, they deal with trauma. Talk about the value of kids being given a place to be heard. Because I know we tend to want to speak, right? We want to fix things. We want to give them, let's throw the Bible verses at them that are going to fix this. But talk about that. I've heard you talk about it before, and I think it's important for us to hear.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we've learned through the years is that when you are exposed to any level of fairly significant trauma, it takes its toll on you mentally and physically and spiritually, and fortunately, because of the unfortunate experience that we've had in fighting world wars and watching soldiers come back who have been impacted by what they've been through, what they've seen. A significant body of research has emerged, and now we know this to be something called post-traumatic stress that manifests in people in any number of different ways. So physically and emotionally and psychologically and even spiritually, manifestations of that. And one of the things that we've learned that you're alluding to, Walt, is that the earlier we can get people to start talking about their experience, the less chance there is that this post-traumatic stress will develop into the syndrome that we call post-traumatic stress disorder. And so if kids have a safe place to talk about what it is that they've been through and are encouraged to tell their story, and there are people who discipline themselves not to have to talk, like you've said, but who are good listeners and are willing to listen over and over and over again to perhaps the same story. What the research tells us is that chances are significantly lessened, reduced for those particular kids to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So, some of the symptoms are things like flashbacks, vivid memories, intrusive thoughts, and nightmares. It's not uncommon for folks who've been exposed to some traumatic event, to wake up with horrific nightmares.
All right, night terrors, right? They call it night terrors. Yeah.
Sleep disturbances, situational depression, physical manifestations, anxiety, stomach complaints, dizziness, things like chest pain, irritability, outbursts of anger for, kids for whom this has not been typical behavioral patterns, feelings of intense guilt. We had that with some of the Columbine kids who had survivor's guilt, because their friends were taken and they weren't. One girl, a friend of a daughter of a friend of mine, who that day spilled something on herself early in the day, went home at lunchtime, and her best friend was killed. Struggled, with intense survivor guilt. And what we know is that these kinds of manifestations are normal for about 30 days after an event. But after that, then if they continue to persist, we want to encourage them to get some help. But the way to alleviate that from happening the research tells us is to get them talking.
Yeah.
So providing those safe places is really, really important.
And when you say the same story over and over again, you're talking about the same story over and over again from the same person.
Yeah, that's right.
They just need to keep talking.
They just need to get it out. They need to get it on the table where they can look at it and feel it and listen to it. And
So that's great advice for youth workers. Just, the thing I'm hearing here is we don't always have to have an answer.
No,
it's best
absolutely.
to just sit back and listen. And, that goes back a lot to what you said in the beginning about just, you realize one of the takeaways, just how unprepared we are for these things. And so that's good advice. Rich, in just a couple of minutes, the last couple of minutes.
Let me just say one thing. Sure. Years ago, Jay Kessler, who was the president of Youth for Christ and then became the president of Taylor University, he said something I've never forgotten. He said, the best witness is witness.
The best witness is witness.
The best witness is witness. I think, as youth workers, we underestimate how important our witness, our willingness just to be with kids really is.
Yeah. Well, here's the last question I have for you, and then I want to turn the corner and talk about some resources. But counseling, help us. I think I've always felt that one of the best things that a youth worker can do to prepare themselves for times of crisis is to have at arm's length a list of people who are qualified counselors who can deal with whatever the variety of issues are. What do we look for in a counselor? When you talk to youth workers, what do you, in terms of referrals, who are the kinds of people they want to look for? How do we vet them? Do you have any suggestions on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, let me say a couple things. One, just back up a bit and say, I think when it comes to helping resources, we need to know two groups of folks. First, we need to know ourselves.
Right.
And we need to be okay with our limits. Okay? God, for most of us listening today, right? God has called us to be disciple makers, not therapists. Be okay with that. Okay? Because God uses disciple makers as bridges to the help that kids really need. Without that critical bridge, kids will never get the help. But in addition to knowing ourselves and our limitations, we need to know our friends. So we need to get really good at being referral agents. And I use the acronym RATS to kind of talk, because sometimes kids think, oh, you're going to rat on me, you're going to tell other people. No, I want to get you the best help that you can get. So R stands for responsible. I've got to be responsible in recognizing my limits, but also my responsibility as a parent or a youth worker to get this kid the best help that might be available. A stands for appropriate, because just because somebody is good at one issue doesn't mean they're going to necessarily be good at another issue. So if I have a kid who's struggling with cutting, self-injurious behavior, if they're struggling with that, I don't send them to somebody whose expertise is dealing with cocaine addiction. Now, if there's a cross addiction, which there very well may be, then one or the other of those therapists might be the most appropriate. But I want to be sure that it's an appropriate referral when I make it, which means I have to do the diligence. I have to do the homework prior to a crisis happening of discovering who the best resources are in my community. When I taught at Denver Seminary for a bunch of years, youth and and family ministry, one of the assignments I would give youth workers was to do a community survey. And really what it did was involve finding out who are the youth serving therapists and agencies in the community or surrounding communities where you are, so that when a crisis happens, you don't have to frantically look for somebody, but you already know who they are. It's got to be timely. Mm-hmm. As soon as you know this is over my depth, over my head, or recognize specialized help is really needed here, or maybe this kid is in danger to himself, herself, or others, it's time to bring in the backup, right? And then the last thing, we've got to be sensitive to financial need too. One of the things I got really good at as a church youth worker, and then as a youth worker in agencies through the years, was finding some sugar daddies, some people who I could rely on, who would help me get kids help without knowing the kid they were helping, but who would write a check, because, Walt, as you know, it's getting harder and harder to get insurance to cover for help these days. And so, one of the ways we serve kids is by also helping make kids and families is by helping make it financially feasible.
Right.
Here's one other warning, if I can just say it quickly, and that is, just because a person is a Christian counselor doesn't mean they're a good counselor. Just because a person has a counseling degree doesn't mean they're good at connecting with kids. So part of the work that we need to do in preparing ourselves for referral is meet with these folks and get a sense, talk with other youth workers in the area, pastors who've been around for a while, and find out, who have you had success in referring kids and families to that I can also use as a resource?
That is good advice, and I couldn't agree with that more, especially what you said about just because someone is a Christian counselor or says they're a counselor. I mean, and you and I know this. We've talked about this, that one of the most frustrating things about life and ministry in today's world is it seems that it's getting so much easier to get credentials. And you really don't have to work hard or study hard to get credentials. And so the burden is on, if you want to be a counselor, and I tell people this all the time, don't just get the degree in the cheapest, easiest, fastest way you can. You're making an investment in other people's lives, and you better do it well. Prepare yourselves. The same thing with theological education. So responsible, appropriate, timely, and sensitive. That's good. Well, Rich, this is really good, and we always end up just with some book recommendations. I'm going to ask you if there's anything that's been helpful to you, but first let me just mention, there are 3 books that we have here, and we carry these with us wherever we go. We really want to put them in the hands of people because we believe in them, and it just so happens that you and our good buddy Jim Hancock are the authors of each. The Youth Worker's Guide to Helping Teenagers in Crisis. Again, I tell people all the time, this should be on your shelf. You should read it and then put it on your shelf at arm's length, because when the crisis comes, this is a good starting point. Pull it off. You've got, people's heads spin and we get confused when we're in the midst of crisis. And what you'll get here, folks, is just some good advice. It's cataloged in some great ways. There's a good index in here. So this is a good one. And then there's another one that looks very similar to it that's called The Parent's Guide to Helping Teenagers in Crisis, and so we recommend that as well. Same type of thing for parents. And then you guys a few years ago put together this new resource that I think is just awesome called The Volunteer's Guide to Helping Teenagers in Crisis, where there are 4 teaching sessions on video, DVD, and then how to understand crisis, spot crisis, respond to crisis, and prevent crisis. Those are the 4 sessions. And there's a workbook, a participant's guide that goes along with that. So I love what you say. Here's the beauty of these books, that I think of it this way, Rich, that you get to know yourself, you know your limits, and one of the things we can all do after we know our limits is connect the dots between people who are in desperate need of help and the types of people that can give them the help that they need. So these books are all helpful with that. What about you? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, I just want to also mention a couple. One by our good buddy Marv Penner.
Yes, we'll mention
called
it,
Help My Kids Are Hurting, Survival Guide to Working with Students in Pain. Great resource.
And his
Chap
book on
Clark.
cutting.
Yeah, that's
Hope and
right.
Healing for Kids Who Cut. So we'll put,
yes.
and we put links up to all these books, folks. You can check on the page for the podcast. You're going to mention Chap's book?
Yeah, I really think Chap's book called Hurt Inside the World of Today's Teenagers is a critical resource. If you're going to parent or you're going to work with teenagers in today's culture. And then an oldie that you might even have some difficulty finding, but I've quoted it for years. I think it's an invaluable resource. It's called A Gift of Hope, How We Survive Our Tragedies, written by Robert Venenga. It was published by Ballantine Books, and occasionally I find old ones online that are still available. I've recommended it for years. I just think it's got great transferable concepts to what we do in youth ministry and in parenting, and I recommend that as well. I could go on because there's just great resources, organizations to recommend, but I know you'll have a lot of that online.
Yeah, Rich, this is good. Thanks so much for taking time to do this. I know you've been a blessing to Lisa and to myself. Personally, you've been a great friend. You've been a blessing to our ministry. You've been a blessing to my years in youth ministry, and I know I speak for everybody in youth ministry and parents as well. So thanks for being available. Thank you, too, for your work with Compassion. We love Compassion, and I think what we'll do is we'll include a link to Compassion as well, as you've talked about that. Lisa and I believe firmly in the ministry. We've seen it work and had the joy of you hosting us. I know we're not as fun and famous as some of the people you take around the globe. That's always fun to hear about. But we sure did enjoy our time with you. It was eye-opening and a real blessing to us, transformative in so many ways. So thank you for what you do. Will you come back? We'll talk about some.
You know what? I'd love to do that. Can I leave folks with just one quote?
Sure.
Okay, it's from Madeleine L'Engle, one of my favorite writers.
A Wrinkle in Time.
And she says, in a very real sense, not one of us is qualified, but it seems God continually chooses the most unqualified to do his work to bear his glory. If we're qualified, we tend to think we've done the job ourselves. If we're forced to accept our evident lack of qualification, then there's no danger we'll confuse God's work with our own or God's glory with our own.
That is awesome. Thanks so much. And that's what we're going to end on. So, folks, thanks for joining us on this episode of Youth Culture Matters, and we'll see you next time we're back.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.